In the summer of 1888, a woman was living in a lodging house on Dorset Street in Whitechapel. She was ill, not the kind of ill that passes with rest and warmth, the kind of ill that settles into the body quietly and doesn't leave. She had a diseased lung. She had a damaged uterus. She was malnourished, she was exhausted, and she was alone. She had once had a husband, she had once had children, she had once had a home in the respectable suburbs of London, where she kept a decent life together for the people she loved. By 1888, all of that was gone. On the morning of September 8th, she needed money for her bed. The lodging house deputy told her she couldn't stay without it. "Go out and find it," he said. She went out. She was found less than 3 hours later in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street. Her name was Annie Chapman. And this is her real story. This is Crime Archive, Episode 2 of The Women of Whitechapel. Annie Chapman was born in September 1841 in Paddington, London. Her father was a soldier in the Life Guards, one of the most prestigious regiments in the British Army. It was not a wealthy life, but it was a stable one, shaped by discipline and respectability. Annie grew up, and in 1869 she married a coachman named John Chapman. They settled in Windsor and later in Clewer, comfortable enough addresses that sat well above the poverty line. They had 3 children together, a daughter named Emily Ruth, a son named John, and another daughter whose name history has not preserved with certainty. For a period in the 1870s, Annie Chapman's life looked the way Victorian society said a woman's life should look: a husband, children, a home, a place in the community. And then the losses began. The first loss was the one no parent ever recovers from fully. Annie and John Chapman's youngest daughter died in childhood. The records are incomplete about exactly when or how, but the loss of a child leaves a mark on a marriage that not every couple survives. Their son John was born with a disability that significantly affected his daily life. Annie cared for him, but caring for a child with additional needs in Victorian England, without the resources or support structures that barely exist even today, was an enormous and largely invisible burden. By the late 1870s, the marriage was fracturing. Drink played a role on both sides. Grief played a role. The slow accumulation of hardship played a role. By 1884, Annie and John Chapman had separated. He agreed to send her 10 shillings a week, a modest but survivable allowance that kept her from the worst of destitution. And then, in December 1886, John Chapman died. The allowance stopped. Annie Chapman was 45 years old, unwell, separated from her surviving children, and suddenly without the only financial support keeping her from Whitechapel. Here is the detail that reframes everything that follows. Annie Chapman did not end up in Whitechapel because she gave up. She ended up in Whitechapel because the man whose death stopped her income was not her estranged husband. It was the system itself. Victorian England had no widow's benefit for separated women, no safety net for mothers whose husbands died before a formal divorce was arranged, no recognition that a woman in Annie Chapman's position, ill, aging, separated but not divorced, had any claim on support whatsoever. John Chapman died. The money stopped, and Annie Chapman fell, not because of who she was, because of what the system refused to provide. By 1888, Annie was living between lodging houses in Whitechapel, the same desperate geography that had swallowed Polly Nichols. She tried to earn money through various means, selling flowers, selling matches, doing crochet work. She occasionally sold sex. She drank when she could afford to. The people who knew her in Whitechapel described her consistently in similar terms. She was quiet. She was kind. She kept herself as clean and as presentable as her circumstances allowed. One witness described her as always trying to keep herself tidy, a detail that lodges itself in the mind when you consider what she was living with: a diseased lung, a malnourished body, a 4-penny bed in a Dorset Street lodging house, and still trying to keep herself tidy. In the weeks before her death, Annie had been unwell enough that people around her noticed. She had bruising on her face from a fight with another woman at the lodging house over a bar of soap. She was visibly struggling. In the early hours of September 8, 1888, Annie Chapman returned to the lodging house on Dorset Street. She didn't have her bed money. The deputy, a man named Donovan, told her she couldn't stay. She asked him to keep her bed for her. She said she wouldn't be long. A witness saw her on Dorset Street shortly after. She appeared unwell. She was clutching her stomach. At around 5:30 in the morning, she was seen talking to a man near the entrance of 29 Hanbury Street, a lodging house whose backyard was accessible through a passage from the front door. The witness later described the man as dark, wearing a deerstalker hat, appearing older than Annie. They exchanged a few words. Then they went through the passage together. At approximately 6 a.m., a resident of 29 Hanbury Street went into the backyard. He found Annie Chapman. What he found was so extreme in its violence that when the doctor arrived shortly afterward, he initially struggled to process what he was seeing. Annie Chapman had not simply been killed. Her body had been mutilated in a manner that demonstrated not just violence but knowledge, a level of anatomical understanding that the examining physician, Dr. George Bagster Phillips, stated publicly at the inquest had required skill. Someone with medical or surgical knowledge, he suggested, had been at work in that backyard. That observation sent a ripple through the investigation that has never entirely settled. Annie Chapman was identified at the mortuary by her sister and by Amelia Palmer, a friend from Whitechapel who had known her in better times and had seen her on the street just days before her death. Her son, the one born with a disability, the one she had cared for through the collapse of her marriage and the loss of everything else, was still alive somewhere in England. Whether he ever knew how his mother died, the records do not tell us. Her daughter Emily Ruth had emigrated to France. She learned of her mother's death from a distance, separated from her by water and circumstance, and years of a life that had pulled them apart. The investigation found the same wall it had found after Polly Nichols. Nothing. No confirmed suspect. No arrest. No answer. The city was now certain it had a serial killer in its streets. The press was in a frenzy. Scotland Yard was under enormous pressure, and Annie Chapman, the woman who had lost a child, raised a son with a disability, survived the death of an estranged husband who had been her last financial lifeline, and still tried to keep herself tidy in a fourpenny lodging house, became the second name on a list that the world would remember forever under someone else's. Annie Chapman was 47 years old when she died in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. She had been a daughter of a lifeguard soldier, a wife, a mother, a woman who had outlasted grief and poverty and illness and separation, and still got up every morning and tried. She ended up in Whitechapel not because she was weak, but because every structure that might have held her, marriage, allowance, family, health, had been taken from her one by one until there was nothing left to hold on to. She asked the lodging house deputy to keep her bed for her. She said she wouldn't be long. She was right about that. Her name was Annie Chapman. Remember it. Next week on The Women of Whitechapel, Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish immigrant who crossed an ocean to build a life in London, and the night Whitechapel found her too. Comment the word mysteries below if Annie's story moved you, and subscribe to Crime Archive so you don't miss a single episode of this series, because every one of these women deserves to be more than a number. Crime Archive. Some files never close.